collaboration with the disability view for deaf people. So let's have a big round of applause for her. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Well, we've got a full house on what promises to be an incredibly, well, hopefully insightful conversation on experiments and democracy. And, I think this is, it's an important time also to do it because it's election year in many, many countries. I think two of the biggest elections will happen this year, two elections that everybody is watching. Of course, the world stops when America has elections. And, well, I think mostly, I think India stops really when we have elections. So it's a big election year. And I just wanted to start off with asking our panelists, in many ways, both their books, Quraishi Saab and Yascha's book, both look at democracy as experiment. They talk about experiment in democracy. And I wanted to start off with Quraishi Saab, asking him why he has chosen the word experiment to describe the Indian democracy. You can take my mic.
Thank you very much. You must have noticed I needed help to get up. The problem, I'm not old, only 76. My knees are giving me trouble. I have been civil servant, but my backbone is intact. This book is actually a collection of my articles. This is the third book in a series which I wrote on the elections. My first book, which I consider monumental, An Undocumented Wonder, The Making of the Great Indian Election, which explains India's elections evolution right from the Constituent Assembly debates. Now, this book is a collection of my published articles. So now, obviously, the newspapers will publish an article on subjects which are controversial, which are urgent. So suddenly something happens, some party breaks up, somebody defects. I get phone calls from the newspapers, please write an article in 3 hours, 4 hours, maybe by tomorrow. So it's a collection. So all those eventful things are here. When I was writing the book, I have two critics, resident critics, my wife and my daughter. So my daughter questioned the name. She said, why do you call it experiment? We are an established democracy, 70-year-old democracy, and you are calling it experiment. So I had to explain to her, and that is the question which Mandira also asked. The reason is that when we chose democracy, it was considered an experiment. And in fact, it was considered a misadventure, a wild experiment. And the Western world thought that we have gone mad. Why? Because that was the time when 86% of our population was illiterate. We were socially divided. We were extremely poor. 565 princely states. And we were going through the throes of partition. At that time, to choose democracy, that was it's indeed an experiment. And if the Western world thought that we are going to flop in no time, we proved the prophets of doom wrong the very first attempt. Second thing, the important thing is that when we chose democracy, we gave equal voting rights to men and women. You might take it for granted today, but if I tell you the context, why this is very important. Very often I've been asked this question, even USA doesn't use EVM, why do you use EVM? Now, I tell them that USA took 144 years to give equal voting rights to women, and we gave it on the day one. So therefore, it's not that we have to learn everything from them. Secondly, in 19 years of our republic, we had a very powerful woman prime minister. In 250 years, US has not had a woman president. So who has to learn from whom? And actually, I've received lots of requests, mostly in jest, but sometimes seriously, after the Florida fiasco of 2000, that why don't you come and conduct a US elections? Now, imagine Donald Trump, before the election, he said, if the results go against me, I will not accept it. Can you imagine that happening in India? In India, the loser hand over the chair with folded hand to the winner with dignity. The transition of power has been so smooth all these 75 years. So therefore, actually, this experiment has been greatly successful. The very first election by the first Chief Election Commissioner, Sukumar Sen, since he was not in the age of media, not many know about him, he did a wonderful job. 80% of what we do today was founded by him from scratch. There was no experience, no experiment, no staff, no nothing. He created out of nothing. We need to applaud him.
Yeah, now the mic is working. So you, however, looked at experiment in a different way. You're looking at democracies under threat, and it goes beyond India. You're looking at the fact that diversity, that countries in the West, are becoming more diverse, and it's moving from a homogenous to, a more, pluralistic. Might be distinct, but how do you look at experiment of democracy then?
Yeah, I mean, I think every democracy in the world is an experiment in two senses. The first is that it is still a relatively new form of government. It's wonderful to be here in India and to be here in Jaipur. The disadvantage is that it's in the middle of my term. So yesterday, I had to go to my hotel room and teach in the middle of the night. And what I was teaching was some of the founding texts of American democracy, the Federalist Papers and other writings. And when they are trying to establish democracy at the time, at the end of the 18th century, we forget this now, every human attempt at self-government in history had failed. Right? Ancient Athens had failed. The city-states of medieval Italy had failed. Various experiments of democracy around the world had failed. And so they were embarking on an experiment of whether or not we can actually design the kinds of institutions that are going to sustain our ability to govern ourselves collectively. And in particular, whether we're going to be able to stop these societies from polarizing into factions that hate each other so much that they're willing to tear down these democratic institutions because me winning is more important than us together sustaining our democratic system. So that was the first sense in which we tend to talk about an experiment in democracy. And of course, India, as you were saying, was a remarkable experiment when the democracy was founded, because it was the biggest democracy in the world, as it remains, because it was a population that at the time was in its majority non-literate, and many people thought that Indian democracy would fail, that this experiment couldn't possibly work. And you're right that it's been a remarkable success story that India has sustained its democracy despite these initially adverse circumstances for so long. But there's also a second sense in which democracies are a great experiment. And it helps to think about what an experiment is, right? There's kind of two different types of experiment. Yeah. One is where, the teacher comes into school and he sort of lets one liquid flow into the other, and there's an explosion, and then he explains some chemical process to you. So he knows exactly what's going to happen. The experiment is to demonstrate something known. But the way we are talking about experiment today, it's embarking on something unknown, is to embark on a new course of action with an uncertain outcome. And I think that the diversity of many democracies around the world is an experiment in that sense. When I look at Western Europe, where I grew up, most of these societies, when they were founded as democracies, were relatively homogeneous, had a lot of ethnic homogeneity, a limited amount of religious diversity, and that is the circumstances under which they were founded. When I look at societies in North America, they had always been somewhat more diverse, but they always had a very clear ethnic, racial, and religious hierarchy, with one group at the top and others further towards the bottom. And what we're trying to do today is to create societies where we treat all members as genuine equals. Societies that have become a lot more diverse, and in which we actually treat people with respect and dignity, irrespective of a group that they are from. And that's really a new experiment as well. And of course, that has implications for India too, because India too was a very diverse society when democracy was founded at the end of the 1940s, but one in which, whatever may have been written on paper, in the lived reality of a society, there was very strong dominance hierarchies of caste, of social class, and of religion. And the great question for India today remains whether it can sustain and build a genuinely equal democracy in which people are treated with dignity and equality irrespective of a community from which they stem.
Girishji, I wanted you to respond to this. In some ways, the experiment of democracy that you've seen, because we see it from the grassroots, and we do, every day is an experiment in democracy. So
yeah, I mean, I have slightly contrarian views. Though definitely we can be happy and proud of the model and the democracy. But there are two important points we can't ignore. First is that no single government, since we have been having elections 1952, no one government has ever got more than 50% votes. Closest was Rajiv Gandhi, around 48%. Number one. And number two, we don't elect the opposition. The democratic structure is we vote out the ruling party, and by that opposition gets a chance. So there is no election in Indian history where there was a strong contender, except say 2014. The change of power happened because of that. So people are fed up with the incumbent and they vote them out and someone gets elected. So I think both of them, one part I agree with them, it's an experiment. But that experiment needs to have a strong system. And I feel the challenge is about the systems, the rule of law. And there that experiment will be tested in due course. That's what my observation is.
So, you make an interesting point, and I wanted to ask you, flag that. In some ways, Prime Minister Modi has changed this, because it isn't, you're electing him each time. He's the electable. Donald Trump has changed that, where he is the electable. It doesn't matter who the other person is. You're not voting out someone, you're voting in Prime Minister Modi or Donald Trump or a certain way. And I wanted to ask you, how does that change? How do you look at it in terms of the elections that we're going into now? How do you look at this fact that there is some ways also, in a way, this move to a presidential form of election for India? And of course, I'll come back to you. But Quraishi Saab, can you talk about that, please?
Yeah, you are referring to the debate which has been going on for almost 10 years, one nation, one election.
Yeah.
Now, the moment you use the word nation, it really incites nationalism in us. One nation, one this, one nation, one that, and we get excited. How about one nation, one leader? One nation, one political party? One nation, one dress? So there is a limit to this one nation thing. Now, as you said, the Prime Minister Modi is likely to win on the basis of his popularity. He is extremely popular. He knows that. And if the election is presidential in its form, he is likely to do very well. But if it is the Westminster model where the MPs are elected across the country and they elect the Prime Minister, then the game is a bit different. So which is why this issue has been controversial. Now, fortunately, when Prime Minister Modi 10 years ago talked about simultaneous elections, originally that was the word that was being used, he said that let there be a national debate. He did not thrust it down the throat of the nation, rightly so. But it seems that they have now decided that they're going to do it, and the latest committee headed by a former president of India has been asked to tell us how they will do it. Frankly, I have written at least a dozen articles in my book, besides so many TV interviews, in which I have given actually pros and cons. There are pros, there are cons. But the cons are so serious. If they are able to establish consensus and constitutional amendments which are required, there is an agreement, well, go ahead and do it. But that the agreement is not easy to come by. And I'm waiting with great expectation. I've been debating this subject in my mind for 10 years. What magic formula this committee comes out with. So let us see what is the result of.
In this connection, I must cite one of the best examples of what democracy it should be. When Margaret Thatcher was invited by the BBC ahead of elections for a prime ministerial debate, she refused. She said, "I'm not a. This is like it's Westminster model. We don't have a presidential form of. My MPs will decide. So that thing is gone. We are almost now assume this versus that. So, and the second part about this one nation, one poll, I think it's not coming. The suggestion is not from the democratic values point of view. It has a very centralist tone, very centrist tone.
Yeah.
So it will impact the federal structure
Yes.
of whatever we are having.
Yes.
And the numbers suggest 78% people vote if there are parliamentary and assembly elections are simultaneous.
Yeah.
The percentage differs from as we go ahead from the.
No, I wanted to add one point. We have been discussing this issue from the point of view of political parties, the elections, not from the point of view of the public.
Yeah.
What does public want? Public love frequent elections.
Yes.
Because most of the people are so poor, the only power they have is the power to vote. Otherwise, what happens after getting elected, an MLA and MP disappears for 5 years, and people have to put up posters, missing, wanted, gumshuda ki talash. So, now, there is no accountability. If there are frequent elections, at least politicians have to keep coming back. So people want it. And I'll finish on that. I was once attending in Pune the youth parliament. One girl from Chhattisgarh came out with an interesting slogan which sums up the entire debate. She says, "Jab jab chunav aata hai, गरीब के पेट में पुलाव आता है."
So every time there's an election, people will get rice.
Yeah.
Is what the loose translation.
Yeah, let me, if you don't mind, as an outsider,
Yes.
me venturing into this debate carefully.
Yes.
I'm thinking back to this text I taught yesterday, right? So when we founded democracy, the question was, and this is a question in every context, how do we stop the tyranny of the majority? How do we stop when in one moment everybody agrees on something, that becoming the permanent state? Because we don't elect a monarch for life. We don't want to go to vote one time and then we can't change our mind. Part of democracy is that we vote for somebody that gives them legitimacy. That means they are supposed to be able to decide some stuff.
Yeah.
But in 4 or 5 years, we have a right to change our mind. And to sustain that, we have to think about how to stop a faction that has a temporary majority from taking over. And the solution to that in the Indian system, and the solution to that in the American system, and in the German system, and many countries around the world, is a federal structure in which there's counterbalances from the regions to the power in the center. And part of that is that, this year there might be one political mood, next year a different one, and 2 years a different one. And so it's important to have some regional and local elections that reflect those different moments of national mood, not just one election at one time in the center. And so I worry a little bit when I hear this, with limited knowledge of India, because I worry that you don't want the mood in one moment to determine every level of political power, because that goes against the kind of limits to centralized power.
Yeah.
And we can't forget, state assemblies are not subservient to parliament. They on their own, they have a legislative power. They on their own, they have a taxation power.
Yeah.
So making them unified and then simultaneous election has.
Also, how do you change? I mean, look at Rajasthan, for example, which always votes out the party at the the ruling party. How do you then fit into this? Quraishi Saab, you had an interesting statistic that I would like you to talk about the idea that we believe that if people vote differently for state elections and for national elections, the agendas are different. How do you have an interesting aspect on that? Can you please talk about that?
Correct. When the Prime Minister 10 years ago talked about simultaneous election, he talked of all 3 tiers: Parliament, Vidhan Sabha and Panchayats. But over the years, Panchayat has been removed from our discourse and discussion, which is very unfair. Panchayati Raj elections are as important constitutionally as Lok Sabha elections.
In some ways much more, because that's where you get...
And in many ways more, because there are 3 million elected representatives of the Panchayat, 4,120 MLAs and 543 MPs. Now, the issues at all 3 levels are different. Suppose I'm living in a village. For me, the concern is the drain which goes outside my house and which is stinking. Now, and you come and tell me about my Ukraine policy?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, the issues are different, and when there is simultaneous election, the issues will get mixed up. Now, very often the argument is, no, look at Odisha. They voted for Vidhan Sabha, they voted one party, for Lok Sabha, they voted some other party, or Rajasthan, as you mentioned. That's right. But there was a study for 20 years, 99 to about 2000, and it found that when the elections were simultaneous, 77% people voted for the same party. 77 is a large number. And when they were 6 months apart, it dropped down to 60%. And when it was many months apart, then you can imagine, because then people vote independently. So these are actually, this is an empirical study which should be talked about more.
But, so, one of the aspects I wanted to talk also about is that, this election, and you talk about this, is also going to be one of the most expensive elections, right? How does money, the US elections last time I think was 9 billion, if I recall correctly. I think the Indian election is far, far more. So you have two countries going to elections. Some of the biggest amount of money is going to be spread. How do you look at money and that into the aspect of democracy, and how does that play a role?
Can we bring in the American election for a moment, because I have bad news for you, or perhaps good news for you, depending on your political opinion. If the election was held in the United States today, Donald Trump would be the next president of the United States.
Yeah.
And it is likely that the same will be true in November. It's by no means certain.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if Biden somehow manages to squeeze through. But at this point, it seems most likely that Donald Trump will be president of the United States again. And I think it's helpful to try and think about the similarities of some of these political figures, to go back to the question you were asking earlier, but I think we haven't answered yet, and how it is that they've managed to build up this immense following. And I think that there's a category of politician that I would call populists, which includes Donald Trump in the United States, people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, some people on the left, like the late Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and arguably Narendra Modi in India would fit that category as well. And what they have in common is not a political program, it's not an economic set of policy, it's not which group they prefer because they're majoritarian in different contexts, right? The outgroups that they often invoke against are very, very different. But what they have in common is a conception of democracy, which says, I and I alone truly represent the people. And anybody who disagrees with me is not just a political adversary who gets some important things wrong, they are a traitor. They are not a true American or Turk or Hungarian or Venezuelan or perhaps not a true Indian, right? And therefore, there shouldn't be any limits on my political power. When the courts say that I don't have the right to do something, when the press criticizes me, when the opposition is campaigning in a vigorous way, that's not a legitimate part of a political system, that's an illegitimate part of a political system. These people are traitors to the true people. And that is what, in my mind, makes these politicians concerning to our democratic institutions. Not that I might disagree with them on this or that policy, or that we might have different ideas about culture or religion. It's that they are saying, I am the only true representative of the people. And so you are saying that's why there's this positive reason that people have to vote for them, right? And I think that's right, that Donald Trump in the United States, for example, has a very strong following of people who are going to stick with him no matter what. But that's a smaller part of the population. Right? Most Americans don't like Donald Trump. 50% of Americans strongly disapprove of Donald Trump. He's not popular overall.
Yeah.
So why are they able to win nevertheless? And that's something where I think those of us who are critical of these politicians need to look in the mirror a little bit. So I disagree with you that if Trump wins, it's because of Trump's following. Because that's 25% of the population, but not 50% of the population.
No.
If he wins, it's also because the parties that were there before often fail to speak to people, are often overly corrupt, overly distant from average people, and so that creates the opening for these dangerous populists to come in. So we have to condemn the populists, but we also have to look in the mirror at other political parties and movements and say, we got to improve our offering if we are to resist those politicians.
Yeah.
Yeah. This money power is debated very often. And the last estimate after 2019 by Center for Media Studies was 60,000 crores were spent on elections.
That's a lot.
By the political parties and others. The Election Commission only spent 4,500 crores, which is a peanut for a democracy of our size. Now, I have a different view. 60,000 crores, it sounds like very shocking figure, but actually it's a very good thing for India. politicians, black money or white money is getting transferred to the poor. The laborers, the painters, the drivers and others. So if this money is getting recycled, what's the harm? That's good for economy. And even if you don't accept that argument, there is a way of reducing this the expenditure. Law determines that no candidate can spend on his campaign more than X amount. For Lok Sabha these days it's about 90 lakhs or something. But strangely, I can spend only 90 lakhs, but my political party can spend 9 crores on me.
Yeah.
So what is the logic of the limit in UK? From where we borrowed the model, there is a cap on the political party expenditure also. It is so easy for the people in power to do it in 30 seconds. And from 60,000 crores, it will come down to 6,000 crores. If you are serious, please do it.
Yeah.
Second, the suggestion, and we have been, Election Commission has been writing again and again, for 6 months before the election, public advertising should be banned. You know, you see full page advertisement, 5-6 pages for 6 months at public expense. How many crores are getting spent? We have been wanting a ban on it. Nobody is listening to us. So if you are sincere, so listen to the suggestions of sanity, but that's not happening.
Yeah,
I
please
agree with everything except this advertisement.
Yes, I know. We have a problem with that too. I agree.
No, but there are the two serious points. One is, one of the MPs was telling me, Quraishi, I'm sure you will agree with him. He says, it was before the limit was raised, he said, even if I write a postcard to all my voters, my limit will be exhausted. So the dishonesty begins with the limit, number one. And number two, the structure called electoral bonds. I mean, this is outrageous actually. Only one party can have access to who is giving whom, you know.
Yeah.
So it's not a fair thing. It's not a open and transparent system. So as he said, there has to be some kind of a transparency and a level playing field, which we deny to opposition.
I think you have an interesting point about state-funded elections.
Yeah. You know, I'll first talk about the electoral bonds.
Yes.
I think this is the biggest fraud on the nation. And unfortunately,
Good you said that.
you know, when this was announced in the budget speech, I was watching the television. Mr. Arun Jaitley, the finance minister, made a very beautiful statement, which was music to my ears. He says, without transparency of political funding, free and fair elections are not possible. That is exactly what we have been saying. His second statement equally good. For the last 70 years, we have failed to achieve the transparency. Now, what would we expect as the third sentence? That some transparency will come. Third sentence, just the opposite. We are going to introduce electoral bond, and donors want secrecy. Therefore, nobody will know who has given how much to whom. Now, this is strange. Now, donors may want secrecy, but what do people want? We want transparency because there is a lot of quid pro quo which is hidden. The contract, the licenses, the bank loans, they run away to England. So all that is happening. So now 20 crores, 200 crores, nobody knows how much money has been given. So without that, obviously there is no free lunch. If they give them so much money, they run the government. And again, the solution is very simple. 30-second solution. Just announce who has given how much to whom. Go ahead with your banking and electoral bond, but announce it, make it public and see the difference. They're not looking at it.
Yeah.
And from there, I have, since electoral funding has been a matter of public debate, I have suggested that if donor is scared to donate, which I disagree with, same donors have been donating for the last 70 years. We never had any problem. And same donors give to all political parties who are contesting. जो जीत के आ जाए वो हमारा है तो सबको दे देते हैं. So ये कहना कि वो they're scared and there will be action against them, this all I don't buy that. But solution is, let there be national electoral fund. There every donor will donate and it will be distributed to political parties based on their actual performance. Actual performance cannot be fight. I've calculated, for every vote I give you 100 rupees. So you earn this money and you will get it by check. You will not have to go begging or extorting and stealing from people, you will get it by dignity, with dignity by check. So this proposal also has been pending for a long time, but nobody takes it seriously.
So I wanted to ask you, one of the questions that, when you look at South Asia, and we're all going to go into elections, and we look at India, there is an aspect of, when you say experiment and this thing, do you think there is an aspect of the Western gaze on democracy? Because if you look at, you look at everything around us in terms of the democratic indexes that have existed, this thing that's all gazed by the Western idea of democracy. And if you look at America right now, which is really in some ways the country that has been dealing or has experimented with democracy for the longest really, is also going through its own trouble with democracy, right? So is there a certain Western idea of democracy, and somehow do South Asian countries then not at all meet up with these expectations? Quraishi Saab, what would you say to that? And Yascha, sorry, let me ask you first. Do you think there's a Western aspect of democracy?
Yeah, so look, I think the question of whether liberal democracy is going to be the dominant ideology of the 21st century, as it has been in some ways of the second half of the 20th century, is fundamentally about whether countries around the world will find their own interpretations of it to which they become attached, right? Democracy is going to be dominant in the 21st century if India remains a democracy, if Nigeria becomes a functioning democracy, if perhaps one day China might become a democracy. And so the question of how to adapt these systems to local conditions in a way that feels like it is their own is the most important one for people working on these questions in places like Nigeria and China and elsewhere. And I certainly think that there's a danger of a kind of one-size-fits-all solution where consultants fly in from the United States and say in Iraq, okay, this is what the democratic system is supposed to look like, without knowing the place sufficiently well. I will say, though, that the fundamental values of democracy, I think, are universal ones. The fundamental values of the Indian Constitution, which was created by wonderful thinkers and activists and nationalists in India, shares many elements with American democracy, with British democracy, because the fundamental values are two. They are, first of all, collective self-determination, that we together make our rules, rule ourselves, rather than leaving that to kings or military generals or priests of whatever description, or foreign powers that rule ourselves. No, we together as the people rule ourselves. That is one fundamental aspiration of democracy. And the second fundamental aspiration of democracy, without which the self-determination won't persist in a real way, is some amount of individual freedom. But even the people together don't get to tell each of us what we're allowed to say, how we're allowed to worship, how we lead our lives. So we each need some protection against the will even of the majority. And those two values, I think, are universal, irrespective of the national context. And so when you're looking at some of the concerns that people have at the moment about democracy in the United States, which has deteriorated in international indices of democracy, and many other countries too, but also about India, it's because many countries around the world are doing less well at living up to these two fundamental values than they were in the past. I think there are some concerns about free elections in India, but mostly there's concerns about fair elections in India. There's concerns about whether you sustain genuine freedom of speech, whether people of every community in India remain full members of a society with equal standing and equal rank. And I don't think that being concerned about that in India, for people who are also concerned about that in a different way in the United States, in a different way in Hungary, in a different way in Venezuela, is somehow a Western gaze. I think that is just trying to live up to the universal values of a political system that we have in common.
Yeah.
Quraishi Saab, would you respond?
Yeah, when I mentioned to you earlier my book, An Undocumented Wonder, The Making of the Great Indian Election. When I was just about to finish the book, I came across Global Index of Democracy by The Economist. And it classified Indian democracy as a flawed democracy. My first reaction was of anger. Oh, this must be Western conspiracy against India. They have set up parameters which show us in poor light. But when I looked at the detail, why they are showing it as flawed democracy, they were talking exactly about the things about which we are concerned. They, for instance, 25% of India is still illiterate. That brings down our ranking. Only 6% tickets were given to women. That brings down our ranking. There is so much of corruption. 43% of MPs in parliament today have criminal cases against them, multiple cases against them. That brings down our thing. Free press freedom index, we are 144 out of 180. So therefore, exactly, that this is what brings down our level in global democracy index, and not just the economist. In fact, not long ago, last year, when economists, in 2013, we were number 27. We were almost on the verge of becoming full-fledged democracy. Now we are 53. When the economists showed us at 53, so I heard in Hindustan Times the report that some officials went to economist office in London knocking, how do you collect your data? What is this? He said, we'll give you the data. We'll give you, as if now they are doing this survey in 208 countries with the same parameters. We want to give them our own parameters. What are we talking about? Then we, them, and so many, there are 10, 12 such indexes of a different kind. They're all showing us somewhere in the middle. So we need to look at, improve our democracy ourselves. We have to look within, be honest. First of all, we have to come out of the denial mode. Then only we can do the reform. And there is so much work to do.
So,
Yeah, I think in Southeast Asia, most of the nations have adopted skeleton or the exterior part of democratic machine. But do we have the spirit, the democratic spirit? I mean, I criticize you doesn't make me your enemy, right? So that spirit is missing. We may have everything perfectly in place to become an, project with an So this is the issue, and most of the Southeast Asian nations, you look at it. So the Western model, there is a difference between the Western model and what we are, and this is the difference. And the soul is missing. Soul will be a challenge now.
Okay, so my last question, and we're going to open it up for questions after, and I want you to respond in one word. You know, Yascha has said that, you know, he says that there is much more optimism. You know, you cannot be pessimist. You have to be more optimistic about the future of democracy in the world than, then be pessimistic. I'm sort of generalizing and trivializing everything he's written in just one word, but sort of, you know, excuse me, I'm a hack. That's exactly what we said to do. And of course, there's social media. So there, Quraishi Saab, hopeful, glass empty, half full.
One word, resilience. Democracy is resilient. We'll bounce back.
Perfect. You?
I think given how challenging the experiment is, it's remarkable how well it's going despite all of the fears and challenges.
Half full, empty?
Half full, half full.
Okay.
That's always the easy answer.
Okay. Girish?
Democracy always is noisy. So as long as the noise is going around, we can be hopeful. And I feel it is going up. Yeah.
So good. We are ending on a note of hope. Thank you. Now we can open up for questions. Anybody? Okay, there's a young boy right at the end, and I would like to ask him, because one of the aspects I think is that we need to get young people more involved with, you see, sir, you're young at heart, but after the young boy after you, okay.
Sir, I feel that our democracy is becoming inefficient because of the threat of the quality of discussions in electoral politics. I think it is becoming more communal politics, and I want to ask how to bring up the ethics and conduct of our politicians. I believe you can't put onus on the populace for choosing the right politicians.
Anybody want? Quraishi Saab has to answer that?
Yeah. It all depends on the Election Commission's enforcement. There is a model code which very clearly says that you will not indulge in hate speech, inciting speech, and these are things which are also in Indian Penal Code, Representation of People Act. It's a question of enforcement. If you enforce strictly, these things can be controlled. But I think Election Commission needs to do a lot more than they're doing.
Sir, but I believe few parts of
You can only ask one question, Baba. The gentleman right in front, the gentleman with the young heart, the gentleman in, I'm sorry, sir, the one in blue, sorry.
Thank you very much. My question is to Quraishi Saab. suppose in 2024 election, someone is defeated and he turns Donald Trump in India. What will be the result, sir?
You mean 2020?
2024, if someone is elected and he turns into Donald Trump in India, if there is a Donald Trump-like situation in India is what the gentleman is asking, what will we do?
I would rather avoid this thing because it borders on political, and I avoid political questions. Anybody else?
Would you want to, how will you deal with Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, I think to speak about the United States, if Donald Trump gets re-elected, I think it's going to be much more dangerous than the first time around, because in the first time around, he did not have full control of the Republican Party. He didn't have loyalists who had experience governing the country. And he had a kind of vision for America that I didn't share, but that was actually forward-looking and making promises. Today, he has complete control over the Republican Party. He has loyalists who have really gained experience in governing the country, and he's much angrier, much more agitated than he was in 2016. So I don't think we'll come off as lightly in a second term of Trump as we did in the first term of Trump. But that's part of a general trend. So what we see is that when politicians come in who are anti-pluralist, who speak on behalf of the quote-unquote real people, who want to concentrate power in their own hands, they become more dangerous the longer they are in office, because there are countervailing powers, there's regional powers. It's hard to completely get control of a political system. But the longer you're in power, the more you can substitute the members of the Electoral Commission, the more you can shut up journalists, the more you can corrupt the system. And so I do worry that politicians of that ilk, the longer they are in power, the better able they are to undermine basic democratic institutions.
Quraishi ji, you talked about election commission, but how would you view the removal of Chief Justice of India from the panel to select election commission?
No, I think it is absolutely bad optics and unnecessary. Now, how can you imagine a collegium which has the Prime Minister and his nominated cabinet minister and a leader of opposition? You can know sitting here what will be the conclusion. It is 2-1 sitting here. What kind of decision? Even optically it is very bad. After all, Chief Justice used to be the third member. All the appointments which were made in the last 10 years, they were not questioned by political parties. The Chief Justice should have been continued. He is a member of 3-4 other collegium. This deliberately is to spite the people, spite the system, and not acceptable.
Okay. The lady in front, we have to be democratic and equal, so there. Yeah.
Mr. Quraishi Saab, I'm sure all the people here
Ma'am, aapko mic thodi
100% agree that electoral bonds are the biggest fraud on our democracy. There's no doubt about it. My question is, and it's rather an anxious question, how are we going to fix it? Can we look up to our judiciary? I think it can do it if it wants. What is the hope of judiciary fixing it up? It should be very simple for it, though, I think.
I wish. It has been pending before the judiciary for years. They're dealing with small cases. They're deciding bail cases in the middle of the night. But a national issue of this importance, because you know the root cause of corruption in the country is the corruption in electoral politics. If you spend crores, you have to collect crores, and that is where the corruption begins. Now, electoral bond, which has become such a serious issue, our Supreme Court unfortunately has no time for it, which is a pity.
One last question. Can we just squeeze one last question? Sorry, age. Okay, gentleman at the back with, right, the older gentleman.
Just I want to ask, the quality of democracy of a country is determined by election commission, judiciary, media, or people of the country, or voters of the country.
May I answer that? What I will say is that we need the right institutions to protect pluralism, to make sure that democracy, that elections are free and fair, to make sure that there's freedom of speech, to make sure that the opposition has a chance to really campaign. But in the end, no clever set of institutions is going to rescue us from the popular will. There's a lot of attempts that if we change the electoral system in this way in this country, if we change those institutions, perhaps that'll stop people from voting for quote-unquote the wrong people. In the end, the only protection for democracy is to make sure that moderate political parties that want to sustain pluralism, that want to actually have every citizen have a real voice in the country, are compelling enough that they can win elections at the ballot box. No other trick, no other institutional reform is going to protect us than actually winning the commitment of the majority of the people to moderate political parties and to democratic institutions.